Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So this evening we'll be looking at the 5 Indriyas, one of these many numerical lists that we find in Buddhism. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll give a talk on the subject and answer any questions that might come up. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned, this evening I'll be talking a bit about the 5 Indriyas. And for those who want a lot of information about this particular list or different ways that the Buddha used this list and spoke about this list, you can find it in the Samyutta Nikaya. There's a whole chapter of the Samyutta Nikaya called the Indriya Samyutta. So a chapter which is all about the Indriyas. First off, to talk a bit about the word Indriya. So the word Indriya we commonly translate in English as faculty, which I always found a bit of an odd word. When I hear the word faculty, I think of staff members at a school, rather than anything to do with spiritual practice. So the word Indriya then, it means a ability or a capacity to do something. And it's sometimes also understood in the sense of something which brings a sense of control or authority. So the word Indriya itself comes from the word Indra, which was the name of one of the Deva lords. So in Buddhism, there's many names of particular Devas, and Indra is the name of one of the relatively powerful Devas of the sense domain, the sense sphere domain. So Indra then being a representation of authority and power and ability. Then Indriya then has that connotation of something which has authority and control, something which can exercise power. And in the Pali Canon, the word Indriya is used in a number of different contexts. So the list of the 5 Indriyas is one way that the word is used. But Indriya is also sometimes used in a more generic sense to mean any kind of capability or power or ability of any sort. It's also occasionally used to mean one's mind state, so the current state of mind that one is in. It's also sometimes used to mean one's outward appearance, in the sense of one's facial expression, one's physical comportment and attitude, one's body language, so the way one appears externally. So for example, one way that an arhat is sometimes described in the suttas is santindriya, which means one whose indriya is peaceful. So in this case, indriya is used in that sense of one's external comportment, one's body language and facial expression and so on. But in a context of the 5 Indriyas, these are referring to 5 areas of spiritual power, spiritual capability, spiritual development, which are important to focus on and cultivate. So this is sometimes understood to be one of the many complete lists of a complete set of factors which lead to awakening. So, for example, we have the 7 Bojjhanga, the 7 factors of awakening, which are commonly used as a map, a roadmap to awakening. The 5 Indriyas can also be understood in the same way. So this is something which gives a complete list of necessary components for attaining awakening. So I'll talk a little bit about the 5 Indriyas, and then I'll give some explanation, and I'll take any questions. So the 5 Indriya, in Pali we have Saddha, Virya, Sati, Samadhi, and Panya, for a total of 5. And those who are familiar with Pali technical terms should recognize all 5 of these. These are all quite common terms. So the first one, Saddha, we commonly translate this as faith, or sometimes as confidence. And this is particularly defined when the Buddha defines the 5 Indriyas. He defines the Saddindriya, the faculty of faith, or the power of faith. He describes this particularly as having confidence in the awakening of the Tathagata. So having confidence that the Buddha was an awakened being. Or at a bare minimum, having confidence that awakening is possible. That awakening is something which can be achieved, and which therefore has been achieved at some point in the past by various people, and which is possible to be achieved also in the future. So this is a very important component of our practice. It's not to be skipped over lightly. If one doesn't have faith in awakening, then why is one going to bother practicing for awakening? If one doesn't have any confidence that awakening is possible, then why would you even try? Why would you try to do something which you don't believe is possible? So having faith in just the general possibility of awakening is a very powerful supportive condition for one's practice, if one wants to practice effectively and well. And in terms of the particular Buddha of our time, so Gautama Buddha or Shakyamuni Buddha, this is the person who, in Buddhism, we believe to have attained full awakening and passed on instructions for how to attain awakening. So having faith that this person actually was a Buddha, actually was a fully enlightened being, then helps one to give confidence in the Dhamma as well. Confidence that the teachings which we've received are useful in cultivating the path to awakening. And in particular, the way the Buddha describes this quality of faith is having faith in the qualities of the Buddha, which normally in Buddhist monasteries, these are recited every day. Itipiso bhagava arahang samma sambuddho vijacharana sampanno sugato lokavidu anuttaro purusadhammasarati satta deva murusanang buddho bhagavati. So this basic list of what exactly defines a Buddha. So what is it that makes a Buddha who they are, what they are? And I won't go into a detailed description of these 9 qualities. I've done that in other talks. I could actually spend a whole hour, 2 hours just talking about these 9 qualities in detail. But briefly, it's having, once again, faith that the Buddha was fully awakened by himself. So this is one of the important qualities of a Buddha, Samma Sambuddha in particular, is that they, first off, are completely enlightened, which means that they have full understanding of the nature of the mind, full understanding of the nature of reality. They're completely pure of all defilements. So their mind has no trace of greed or hatred or anger or attachment or anything of that sort. No trace of delusion or confusion at all. And no trace of suffering at all. So a Buddha is constantly in a state of bliss, a state of serene happiness. And one other important component about this is that this is something which was achieved by oneself. So a Samma Sambuddha is someone who attains awakening through their own effort without being taught by another awakened being. So this is also a very important element of what defines a Samma Sambuddha. This is not something that was given to them by an external force or an external being, but rather it's something that they developed and realized for themselves through their own effort. And again, this is important because it means that we don't need to rely upon an external power in order to grant us wisdom or to grant us spiritual development or spiritual power of any kind. We don't need to rely upon an external source for that. It's something that we can cultivate within ourselves. And again, one of the qualities of a Buddha is that they have perfect knowledge and conduct. So this means that they never do anything unwholesome. They will never deliberately harm another being. So their conduct is always completely blameless. There's nothing blameworthy to be found. And a Buddha is also the perfect teacher of those who can be taught. So this means that if somebody comes to the Buddha and they have a sincere wish to learn the Dhamma, and they have the capability to understand the Dhamma, then a Buddha will be able to teach them in such a way that they will understand. So this is another aspect of a Buddha, is that they're the perfect teacher of those who have the willingness and capacity to understand. So that doesn't necessarily mean everyone. Some people, when they encounter the Buddha, they just aren't ready. They aren't ready to hear the Dhamma. They aren't ready to understand. So there's many records in the suttas of people meeting the Buddha and not getting it. Like they just don't understand, or they're not interested. It's just not something that appeals to them. They have other goals for their life, and the spiritual path is not something that they have that interest in. So actually the very first human being that the Buddha met after awakening was not interested. The Buddha explained a little bit to this person, and the person was just like, okay, whatever, and walked away. Did not become the Buddha's disciple, did not ask about the Dhamma, did not practice the Dhamma. They just went off and did their own thing. They came face to face with a fully awakened being and completely missed the opportunity. So it's not that the Buddha was incapable of teaching that person, but it's rather that that person was not capable of understanding. They weren't capable of receiving the Dhamma when it was offered. So this is one element of faith in the Buddha, is having faith that the Buddha is the perfect teacher of those who are able to understand. And also faith that the Buddha is the teacher of both devas and humans. So this also is important because, once again, the Buddha is not somebody who has received their spiritual development from higher beings. And even so-called higher beings, so angels and spirits and demigods and so on, even they come to the Buddha for spiritual instruction, for teachings. And again, I could go into a lot more detail on the qualities of the Buddha, but that's just a brief overview so we can understand what we mean when we talk about the power of faith, the faculty, the spiritual faculty of faith. It's this deep confidence that the Buddha was, in fact, a Buddha, a fully awakened being who had these qualities. The next faculty that's listed is virya. So as I mentioned a bit yesterday, the word virya literally means heroism. It's from the word vira, which means hero. So virya is this heroic endeavor to try to accomplish something noteworthy. So just as a hero is someone who courageously charges forward to save the day, then in the same way, then we courageously charge into our own mind to try to clean up the horrific disaster that's in there. So the quality of virya, so the Indriya of virya, this spiritual faculty, the spiritual capability of heroic effort, the Buddha describes it as the 4 kinds of samma vayama, the 4 kinds of right effort that we find listed in the Noble Eightfold Path. So this is one place where the terms virya and vayama are effectively equated. So although we normally translate these words slightly differently, they wind up, the Buddha defines them as meaning effectively the same thing. So the 4 kinds of right effort. The first one is the effort to remove any unwholesome states from the mind. So paying attention to our mind at all times and seeing whenever any unwholesome mind state appears. So any kind of desire, aversion, or delusion, or any of the 5 hindrances, then we make an effort to remove it from the mind. And we also make an effort to prevent unwholesome mind states from appearing in the future. So if there's any unwholesome mind states currently present, we make an effort to remove them. If there's no unwholesome mind states present, we make an effort to prevent any from arising in the future. Similarly, we make an effort to cultivate wholesome mind states, to bring them into being. And also we make a solid effort to develop and perfect the wholesome qualities that we already have. So not just being content with having a little bit of mindfulness, or a little bit of compassion, or a little bit of wisdom, or a little bit of concentration, but we try to keep building it up and developing it and magnifying it and bringing it to its full development. So this is the faculty of virya. It's this heroic effort to become more and more perfect and pure, more and more Buddha-like with every moment. So constantly watching the mind, guarding the mind, purifying the mind, constantly working to eliminate the unwholesome and cultivate wholesome mind states. And actually, right effort can be considered in and of itself a complete summary of Buddhist practice. Though then one has to get into understanding what's wholesome and what's unwholesome, which is why we have the rest of the Dhamma, in order to understand clearly what's wholesome and what's unwholesome. The simplest explanation is that unwholesome traits are anything which causes harm either to oneself or to others or both. And wholesome things are that which brings benefit to oneself, to others, and optimally to both. That's the briefest summary. And of course, the highest form of good is the attainment of awakening. So the most wholesome mind states are those mind states which lead towards awakening, such as the 7 factors of awakening. So another way that one can understand right effort is it's the effort to abandon the 5 hindrances and to cultivate the 7 factors of awakening. That would be another way that one could relate to this practice of samma vayama, or as it's given in the context of the Indriyas, the virya Indriya, the faculty of heroic effort. Then the 3rd Indriya is sati, which we normally translate as mindfulness, which, just for the record, the Buddhist world has actually been using this word mindfulness for about 2,500 years. A little while back, I came across a rather disturbing article where it was talking about the inventor of mindfulness. And they credited the invention of mindfulness to this layman who, oh gosh, should I say names? Are names permitted? So this layman named John Kabat-Zinn, who apparently he's a very nice man and he's done a lot of good things for the world. So I'm not criticizing him in any way, but he was not the inventor of mindfulness. That was the Buddha. The Buddha was the inventor of mindfulness. So these days, people sometimes have a negative association with the word mindfulness because they're associating it with this modern psychology trend. But actually, it's good to keep in mind that Buddhists have been using this word mindfulness for 2,500 years. But we also understand that mindfulness is something which has a place as part of a much broader, vaster, and much more comprehensive system of spiritual development. And that mindfulness by itself is nowhere near sufficient. It doesn't even come remotely close to the perfection of the human heart. So mindfulness is a very important part of Buddhist practice, but it's only one small part of what we do. But nonetheless, it is a very important component of what we do. And the standard definition that the Buddha gives of the sati indriya, so the spiritual faculty of mindfulness, is the four satipatthanas. So the four domains of mindfulness, the four ways of establishing mindfulness, which is, of course, described in a fair amount of detail in the Satipatthana Sutta and also in the Satipatthana Samyutta. So the section of the Samyutta Nikaya, which has many discourses on establishing mindfulness. So for those who want to have a more detailed explanation, you can look at those. I also recently gave a series of Dhamma talks on the four Satipatthana, so that also could be a resource. Of course, there's Bhante Analayo's very comprehensive book on Satipatthana. Bhante G also wrote a very comprehensive book on the subject. So there's many resources if one wants a very detailed examination of the four Satipatthanas. Briefly speaking, though, so this is the effort to cultivate, first off, a very sharp and subtle awareness. So the Buddha uses the word sati nepaka. So nepaka means subtle and refined. So this is not kind of a general vague awareness, but it's a very precise, subtle, refined attention to the most minute detail of one's experience. So it's cultivating an incredibly focused and sharp attention. So not letting the mind become vague or blurry or muddled, but always keeping the mind hyper vigilant, completely focused. And focused not in the sense of narrow, but focused in the sense of refined and detailed awareness. And then the four domains of mindfulness are, so first off, observation of the body, so observing one's physical sensations. Next is mindfulness of Vedana, which we commonly translate as feeling, which in the context of Buddhist practice means the experience of pleasure, pain, and neutral sensation. So clearly observing the reactive quality of sensations, whether we relate to them or react to them as desirable, undesirable, or neutral. Then the observation of the mind, which means to pay clear attention to the characteristics and attributes of one's mind, to the current condition of one's mind. And the fourth one is observation of mental phenomena. So being aware of the thoughts and memories and emotions and so on, which are moving through the mind. So these are the four general domains of mindfulness that the Buddha speaks about, which again gives a complete picture of how to practice. Then the fourth indriya is samadhi, which again is a very important part of Buddhist practice. And so samadhi, it literally means collectedness or unification. So holding together, bringing together, gathering together. So samadhi is the practice of gathering together the mind. So the opposite of samadhi is when the mind is scattered and dispersed and distracted. The mind is going all over the place. So samadhi is when the mind is fully unified and collected together. And this has the characteristic of stillness. Stillness accompanied by sharpness and precision of mindfulness, and also by a sense of deep contentment. So in the early stages of samadhi, it's characterized by euphoria. So this almost overwhelming sense of joy saturating body and mind. And then as when samadhi becomes increasingly refined, then that transforms into a more peaceful and subtle form of contentment and bliss. And when describing the samadhi indriya, the Buddha defines it using the sequence of the 4 jhanas. So the 4 jhanas is one framework of understanding deep states of samadhi, of mental concentration, of meditative stillness, which the Buddha uses all throughout the suttas. So this is a very important system for understanding what samadhi is, so what it means to concentrate and develop the mind. And it's also an important component of the Noble Eightfold Path. So Samma Samadhi is one of the necessary components of our practice, and it is, in fact, the 4 jhanas. So cultivating jhana practice, so learning how to make the mind extremely firm and steady and still, while still maintaining that sharp, precise, detailed mindfulness. This is a very important component of our practice. And one reason why the Buddha gives is very simply, he says, when the mind is in samadhi, it can know and see things as they really are. So samahitang chittang yathabhutang jnanadasanam. So when the mind is in samadhi, it can know and see things as they actually are. So this is, again, it's not to be skipped over. There is no awakening without cultivating jhana, at least if one goes by the explanations found in the early Buddhist texts. Then the 5th faculty that the Buddha gives, the 5th indriya, is panya. So panya indriya. And the word panya is usually translated as wisdom or discernment, which is understood as the ability to directly know the true nature of reality. And when defining the indriyas, the Buddha defines panyendriya in 2 ways. So the first way he describes it is as the wisdom which clearly observes arising and ceasing. The wisdom which clearly observes the appearing and vanishing of phenomena. So in other words, the observation of impermanence, the recognition of the insubstantial, ephemeral, ever-changing nature of all phenomena. So this practice of anicca sanya, which is the central pillar of the vipassana practices, the central pillar of the cultivation of insight, and the central pillar of awakening. Because when we clearly see that all things are impermanent, then we stop grasping at anything at all. We recognize that nothing can be held on to, so we stop trying to hold on to things. We recognize that nothing can be our true self, so we stop identifying as anything. So this cultivation of anicca sanya, the recognition of the appearing and vanishing of phenomena, the ever change of all experience, then as a critical turning point in the cultivation of awakening. And the second way that the Buddha describes the indriya of panya, so the faculty of wisdom, is in terms of clearly understanding the 4 Noble Truths. So first off is clearly understanding our dukkha, clearly understanding our experience of discontent, of dissatisfaction, of unease, of discomfort. So this means that we need to actually directly face the unpleasantness of our experience. Because if we don't face it, then we'll never fully understand it. And if we don't fully understand it, then we'll never get past it. The mind will just keep rolling around in its habitual cycles of self-torment. So this first critical step of wisdom is to then clearly face and observe and fully understand the dukkha that we're experiencing. And the second one is understanding the arising of dukkha. So recognizing how dukkha comes into being, recognizing when it appears, and also recognizing its causal origin. So what causes and conditions lead to an increase in dukkha? So as we pay attention to the mind, we can start to connect the dots and recognize that whenever there's desire or aversion, whenever there's any kind of clinging or grasping or confusion, then there's dukkha. So making this causal connection. And the third one is to clearly observe the ceasing of dukkha. So moment by moment, if you watch your mind, then you'll notice that dukkha is always arising and ceasing, arising and ceasing. Actually, in the Kachanagota Sutta, which we recite every day here at Empty Cloud Monastery, in the Kachanagota Sutta, the Buddha says, it's only dukkha that arises and dukkha that ceases. So dukkhameva upajamanang upajjati, dukkhang nirujamanang nirujjati. It's just dukkha arising and ceasing. So that's all that's going on, moment after moment. It's just dukkha arising and ceasing. So you watch the mind and you see for yourself, you see, oh, there's dukkha ceasing right now as well. There's dukkha arising and there's dukkha ceasing. So the second noble truth is about paying attention to the arising aspect of dukkha, so we can understand what causes dukkha to appear and to increase. The third noble truth is about paying attention to the diminishing, the ceasing, the vanishing of dukkha. And this also is important because sometimes when we get into Buddhist practice and we start thinking about dukkha and paying attention to dukkha, and we start to realize that we're immersed in this giant ocean of dukkha, which seems endless. And it can be a little bit depressing. But then you start paying attention to the mind and you start looking for the ceasing or vanishing or diminishing of dukkha, and you realize that's also going on all the time. So it's not just a constantly building wave of dukkha, but there's also diminishing, there's also fading, there's also vanishing. So we recognize that the cessation of dukkha is not just something that will happen at some distant point in the far future, but actually it's happening right now. If we just pay attention to it, then we can see it. And this is one way of bringing joy into our practice, is by directly observing even the slight diminishing of dukkha that happens from time to time, and recognizing again the causal conditions for that. What is it that leads to a diminishing of dukkha? And inevitably, the Buddha says it's always when we're letting go of some kind of desire, attachment, aversion, wrong view or something. Whenever we're letting go of some kind of greed, hatred, or delusion, especially some form of desire, then our dukkha will correspondingly diminish. So directly paying attention to that is a basis for the arising of liberating wisdom, of the wisdom that leads to awakening. And the fourth noble truth is the path of practice, which is conducive to the cessation of suffering, the cessation of dukkha. So also paying attention to how, when we enact the Buddha's instructions, that our dukkha diminishes, it decreases. So noticing the positive effects that come from our practice. This also is very important for cultivating confidence in the power of the Dhamma, is observing and reminding ourselves of the positive effects that we get through practicing. So we don't just always focus on dukkha, 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 but we also pay attention to the diminishing of dukkha, and we pay attention to the fact that as we practice, then our dukkha decreases. That the more we apply the Buddha's instructions, then the happier we get, and the less suffering we have. So that's a brief overview of the 5 Indriyas. So again, that's Saddha, so faith, especially faith in the awakening of the Buddha. Second one is Virya, so effort or energy, in particular the effort to abandon unwholesome mind states and cultivate wholesome mind states. Third is Sati, mindfulness, in particular the 4 domains of mindfulness. So mindfulness of the body, of feelings, of the mind, and of mental phenomena. Fourth is Samadhi. So in particular, cultivating the 4 jhanas, developing these deep states of concentration and stillness of mind. And the 5th one is Panya, wisdom. So in particular, the wisdom which observes impermanence and is aware of the causal arising and ceasing of dukkha. So I think that's sufficient as an overview. At this time, if there's any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take questions or comments related to this topic. And I see a number of people joining in online. So hello to Laura, Jayanta, Vivian, Mary, Amaranta, Rick, Lely, Jessica, Bhumika, and Scott. Welcome to all of you, and also welcome to everyone else who's watching. And at this time, if there are questions, I will answer questions. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
This may be slightly off topic, but I had a question about faith. As I was wondering, as a layman, and an active practitioner of Buddhist teaching, sometimes I find that those two things, life as a layman and Buddhist teaching can sometimes feel like in conflict, and sometimes it's hard to navigate it. I'm curious what guidance or input does Buddhist provide for someone like myself in these challenging life situations?
Well, there's a few suttas which are specifically aimed at helping lay people integrate the Dhamma into their lives. One of the most well-known one is the Sigalovada Sutta from the Digha Nikaya. Sigalovada Sutta. I can write it down for you later if you like. There's a number of others as well, which are particularly for lay practitioners, but that's the one that's commonly held up as being one of the more thorough and detailed examples. But yeah, just generally speaking, try to make every moment a moment of Dhamma practice. And so Dhamma practice doesn't necessarily mean doing meditation in a dark room for 3 hours, but rather it means doing everything with kindness, with gentleness, with mindfulness, with non-attachment, with an awareness of impermanence, not taking anything too seriously, and especially not taking yourself too seriously, but seeing every moment as an opportunity to be more Buddha-like. And also recognizing that, yeah, it is difficult as a layperson. But what else are you going to do? Are you just going to keep piling up dukkha for the rest of your life? You're just going to keep increasing your suffering? Is that your plan? Of course not. So with the conditions that you have, you do your best to work on diminishing your dukkha, cultivating these wholesome qualities of mind. Yeah, so practice the 5 precepts, practice generosity, practice kindness, maintain mindfulness, and consider also your livelihood. Consider your job. So sometimes it is necessary to change one's livelihood if one has a particularly unwholesome or destructive occupation. But if one's occupation is relatively neutral, then it's just a matter of bringing these qualities of kindness and wisdom to whatever it is. Also with relationships. So with relationships, we see them as a wonderful opportunity to practice kindness, to practice tolerance, to practice patience, and a wonderful opportunity to bring benefit to others, as well as to ourselves. So these are ways to help. As far as faith in the Dhamma, things which really help to build up faith are reading the suttas, helps tremendously, and observing the positive effects of Dhamma practice, that also helps tremendously. It's also a quality which can be deliberately cultivated. If you already have some faith in the Buddha, then you can make it stronger. And that's where devotional practices can be really helpful. Is when saddha is already present, you can make it stronger through devotional practices. If it's not already present, then devotional practices don't usually have much effect. But if you already have a relatively strong faith, then devotional practices will tend to make it stronger. So those are a few things, a few recommendations. I see some questions online. So Scott says, how has Saddha helped you in distressing or fearful situations? Actually, one thing that's been really helpful is reflecting that even if I'm put into very challenging situations, then I can fall back on the mental qualities that I've been developing through Buddhist practice. So when we cultivate a basis of mindfulness, equanimity, and compassion, then pretty much any situation you're in, those qualities will make it better. They'll ameliorate the situation. They'll reduce the difficulty and stressfulness of that situation. So these are universally applicable qualities which you can bring into even the most difficult situations. Even if you're faced with violent people, or you're faced with very painful or disturbing situations, then if you have mindfulness, equanimity, and compassion, then you'll be able to face those situations with a certain degree of serenity. Another thing which is helpful is like, well, even if I don't make it through this, even if I die, well, at least I'll be reborn in good conditions because I've been practicing Dhamma. Yeah, go ahead.
This talk has made me think about one of the chants we do in the morning about the bhikkhunis. They're foremost in wisdom, foremost in faith. I just wanted clarity on something that arose. If an arahant has been perfected, that they still have, don't they all have equal faith and equal wisdom if they're all have attained the final goal?
It's a little off topic. If you could bring that to monk chat tomorrow evening, because that's an interesting question, but it's not quite on the topic of this evening. But make a note of that one and bring it tomorrow. And Anonymous said, what was the name of the sutta you said you chanted the monastery every day? Kachana Gota Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya 12.15. Amaranta says, how can I increase virya? I don't have doubt about the Dhamma. I'm very happy you don't have doubt about the Dhamma. That's a very important quality. As for how to increase virya, one of the ways to do this actually is through paying attention to the uncomfortableness of unwholesome mind states. And that will help motivate you to work on diminishing them. So when the mind is full of craving, well, pay attention to how unpleasant that craving is. And then that will motivate you to remove it. When the mind is full of a wholesome mind state, pay attention to how pleasant it is, and that will motivate you to cultivate it and maintain it. So these are a couple things which are quite helpful. And that's the last question online. Any other questions on this topic, the 5 Indriyas?
Just a comment.
Go ahead.
Speaking of sati, recently, I saw an article that said mindfully drinking, or mindful drinking, which talked about metta sati.
Yeah, and then you can mindfully notice how your mindfulness disappears. Yeah, I mean, you can bring mindfulness to anything. So the military uses mindfulness to train soldiers to be more effective at killing people. So mindfulness in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anything good. So there's a question here, and it's a bit off topic. Let's have a look here. Yeah, so it's a question more about the Satipatthana, which I guess technically it's one of the 5 Indriyas. So this says, my teacher talks about experiencing the mind and mental contents as Vedana in the body. Yeah, that's totally wrong. So the mind is one thing, the body is another thing. In other words, with each thought arises a sensation. Not necessarily. There can be thoughts that do not have a corresponding sensation in the body. So no, I wouldn't say it's always this way. Sometimes it's this way, but not always. So yeah, I don't agree. No, I don't agree that mental objects always have a corresponding physical sensation. I don't agree with that at all. So pay attention to your experience. See for yourself if that's true or not. Yeah, my inclination is no, that's not the way of things. But look at your own experience. See for yourself. Is there ever a mental object which does not have a corresponding body sensation? And I think you'll find the answer is yes. Actually, it's happening all the time. So it's possible I'm just not understanding the instruction your teacher gave, but as you wrote it here, I have to say no, that's not the way of things. That's the last question. Anything else before we wrap up for the evening? No? Okay. So we'll go ahead and end this session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.